The radios were hissing. The perimeter lamps buzzed in the dry Nevada wind. And the north service gate was standing half open, though no one had logged an entry. Night temperatures clung low to the asphalt as the security detail rotated off shift. The guard who made the report, Michael Rourke, 42, former Air Force MP, had worked that corridor for 9 years without a single breach. He knew every hinge, every vibration, every pattern of the restricted sector sensors. That made the anomaly on his last patrol stand out with an uncomfortable sharpness. A metallic tapping behind the blast-sealed utility shed, followed by a single frame of corrupted video on camera N6. The tape wasn't old. It wasn't damaged. The distortion wasn't random. Engineers reviewing it later noted a momentary compression artifact shaped like a thin vertical silhouette, almost stationary, then bending slightly before disappearing. The timestamp indicated a 1-second drop, not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to register in the manual audit. Rourke swore he saw the gate move before the glitch. The sensors insisted nothing was there. His statement mentioned another detail that didn't fit protocol. When he reached the shed, the air smelled faintly of hot wiring burnt insulation, like something had drawn too much current. But every breaker inside the panel showed normal load. He checked the contacts twice. No damage, no scorch, no loose components. He kept walking the perimeter, but the faint impression that he was being paralleled paced just outside the arc of his flashlight beam grew harder to ignore. The next morning, a maintenance tech found shallow marks on the gravel near the utility shed, not footprints. More like narrow pressure tracks forming a wavering line, as if something rigid but lightweight had been dragged with unexpected precision. The trail ended abruptly beside the security fence, precisely where the blind spot of camera N6 began. No one filed an incident report beyond Rourke's testimony. No internal memo circulated. The footage was placed in a low-visibility archive, mislabeled as a routine system hiccup. But those who reviewed it noticed the same quiet detail. The silhouette appeared a split second before the lights flickered across the north corridor. Perfectly timed. Perfectly still. Wind scraped loose sand against the chain-link fence as Rourke replayed the footage on a portable monitor, the glow washing his face in pale static. The guard shack behind him hummed with the stale scent of coffee left too long on a hot plate. Nothing else moved. Nothing else breathed. Only the single corrupted frame pulsed in and out as if the machine itself hesitated to show it. Rourke leaned forward, elbows locked. He slowed the playback to quarter speed, then frame by frame. A silhouette warped at the edges, slender enough that the compression algorithm shouldn't have preserved it at all. Yet it held for the fraction of a second before dissolving into snow. His cursor hovered over the impact line where the data drop occurred. The metadata showed no external interference, no surge, no ground fault. The system insisted it had created the error on its own. He radioed control for an authorization to inspect the north corridor wiring. Protocol required a 2-person sweep, but control responded with a clipped instruction to stand by. The overnight supervisor was occupied with a comms check. That pause stretched longer than protocol normally allowed. Rourke stepped outside, jaw tight, and scanned the fence line. Something about the silence felt curated, like sound itself had been stripped from the sector. A generator in the distance hiccuped, a quick metallic skip, just enough to draw his attention. The lights above the outer road dimmed for half a heartbeat, brightened, then stabilized. When they leveled out, he noticed something on the ground 10 yards from the shack, a sliver of reflective material lying half buried in the dust. Not foil, thicker. He knelt, brushing sand off its surface with 2 fingers. It was a curved fragment of polycarbonate clear, with a faint amber tint about the size of a fingernail. The edge was smooth, heat-warped, but not burned. He held it up against the floodlight. The material refracted light unevenly, bending the beam into two distinct streaks. Equipment on base used similar polymers, but nothing that matched this thickness or tinting. He pocketed it before anyone could step outside and ask questions. Movement at the far end of the road snapped his head up. A shadow passed behind the maintenance trailer, a quick, sharp angle, not matching the rhythm of a person walking. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and advanced, boots crunching softly. At the trailer's corner, he paused, listening. The air carried that faint electric smell again, hot but localized, as if whatever had caused it had slipped past just seconds earlier. He rounded the trailer. Empty sand, empty fence, empty sky. But closer to the fence, a section of gravel had been pressed flat in a perfect, parallel pattern, 3 thin impressions running side by side, then vanishing at the exact point where the camera's blind spot began. The radios hissed again. The hissing grew sharper, like each burst of static carried a clipped whisper buried beneath it. Rourke adjusted the gain on his handheld, but the distortion only tightened, curling into a metallic rasp that vanished the instant he stopped moving. He tried again, 1 step forward, hiss. 1 step back, silence. The pattern wasn't random. It was responding to displacement. He followed the trail of flattened gravel toward the blind spot. The floodlights behind him cast long, clean lines across the fence, but ahead, the illumination thinned unnaturally, as if the bulbs were pushing against a veil of low humidity that existed only in that narrow stretch. He raised the flashlight and swept. No animal, no equipment. Just the strange, wavering shimmer of warm air over cold ground. And his radio clicked no call sign, no protocol, just a single steady carrier tone. He froze. The tone held for 8 seconds, long enough for every trained instinct to tighten. When it cut out, a faint thump rolled through the ground beneath him. A sub-bass vibration felt more in bone than ear. He scanned the fence line again, pulse thudding, and caught sight of something lodged in the mesh 2 posts down. He approached slowly, keeping his light low. The object was wedged roughly at shoulder height, a strip of flexible polymer, narrower than a finger, braided in a way that suggested structural purpose, but not design. It had no markings, no fasteners, no reason to exist. He reached out, but the radio snapped to life again, 3 sharp bursts of static, followed by the same carrier tone. He pulled his hand back. The tone stopped. Rourke stepped away from the fence and circled wide, entering the blind spot zone from a different angle. The air temperature shifted immediately, dropping at least 10 degrees within a single stride. He exhaled and watched his breath plume faintly. That shouldn't happen here, not with the generators running, not with the ground retaining so much of the day's heat. He keyed his mic, but the signal light didn't activate. The radio refused to transmit. He tapped the casing. No response. At the midpoint of the blind spot, a shape resolved darker than the sand, low to the ground. He knelt beside it. A maintenance clipboard lay half-buried. The metal clip bent outward as though something had gripped it with measured force. Rourke brushed it clean. The inspection sheet attached to it showed a timestamp from earlier that evening, filled out by a technician named Harris. Rourke knew Harris. He also knew Harris had been assigned to the opposite side of the base all night. A faint scraping noise drifted from behind him. He pivoted, beam slicing through dust. Nothing. But the gravel a few feet away vibrated, a quick tremor radiating in a perfect semicircle, like something displacing weight just under the surface before lifting off again. The tremor lasted less than a second. The silence afterward stretched tight. Rourke backed out of the blind spot, forcing his radio to reconnect as he reached normal air. The signal light flickered back to life. Control finally responded to his earlier request voice flat, unconcerned, authorizing a wiring check in the north corridor at dawn. No mention of interference. No mention of the anomalies. Rourke glanced back at the fence. The polymer strip was gone. Dawn hadn't broken yet, but the sky carried that thin pre-light gradient that made the metal structures around Sector North look colder than they were. Rourke signed out a diagnostic kit from the supply cage and logged his route, ignoring the faint tremor in his hand as he clipped the panel key to his belt. The corridor ahead lay empty, silent, washed in the harsh amber of night cycle lights. As he approached the utility shed, he noticed the door wasn't aligned. It wasn't open, not visibly, but the frame sat a millimeter off its usual seal, as if it had been pulled outward and settled back imperfectly. He crouched, checking the hinge pins. No scratches, no forced entry, but a faint smear of dust along the threshold suggested the door had moved within the last few hours. He keyed in the unlock sequence. The panel released with a dry metallic sigh. Inside, the cramped space smelled of copper and machine heat. Wiring bundles lay exactly where they should, except for one conduit along the right wall. Its anchor clamp was rotated a few degrees counterclockwise, subtle enough that only someone who'd memorized this panel would notice. Rourke knelt and checked the clamp. No tool marks. No fingerprints. The metal was slightly warm, but the conduit hadn't carried a heavy load overnight. He scanned the insulation with a thermal reader. A thin, vertical hotspot glowed along the conduit's edge too straight, too controlled to be a fault. The radio on his shoulder emitted two soft clicks, like someone tapping the transmit button from a distance. Rourke froze. No voice followed, no static. Just the two clicks. A quiet code used informally between guards on night shift to signal proximity without alerting intruders. Except no one else was assigned to this sector. He stepped out of the shed, eyes narrowing at movement near the outer access road. A figure crossed the gap between two storage crates, slow, deliberate. The reflective stripe on the uniform caught the light just enough to confirm it was base issued. Rourke called out, "Identify." The figure paused, then continued walking without turning. He followed, boots crunching softly. The figure rounded the corner of the second crate. Rourke turned after it and found the alley empty. The only thing left was a folded maintenance checklist resting on the crate's edge. He lifted it. The form listed routine inspections for power distribution nodes, all initialed by Harris again. Same handwriting, same signature loop. But the timestamp printed at the top was impossible. It showed a time 2 hours in the future. Rourke scanned the paper. The ink was dry. The paper wasn't warm from a printer. It had been out here long enough to collect a faint ridge of dust along one edge. A metallic snap echoed across the yard. Rourke spun, flashlight sweeping across stacked crates and the distant perimeter. At the far end of the corridor, the gate he'd found half open the night before shifted, just a subtle inward flex, as though the metal had responded to a breeze that didn't exist. The sensors around it stayed dark. No alarms. No motion flags. Nothing. He approached slowly, heart pounding with a measured dread. The gravel near the gate held those same narrow, parallel impressions, fresh and slightly deeper than before. They led straight to the hinge mechanism, then veered into a perfect arc before stopping at a dead angle beneath the camera. Rourke raised his radio to report the unauthorized movement, but the device vibrated in his hand, a short, sharp buzz. Not a malfunction, a deliberate pulse. One that matched the pattern used by proximity monitors installed on experimental equipment, though none of that hardware should be active in this sector. He lowered the radio, listening to the wind slip around the fence. Something had learned the perimeter's rhythm. Something was pacing him with intent. Behind him, the utility shed door clicked shut. Rourke spun, boots skidding on the gravel. The shed door stood sealed, the latch fully engaged. He hadn't touched it after stepping out. No wind angle could have pulled it shut with that crisp mechanical finality. He approached slowly, testing the air with a steady breath. The temperature around the shed had dropped again, the cold clinging tight at ankle height, as if pooling rather than drifting. He gripped the handle and pulled. The door opened easily, too easily. Inside, the overhead bulb flickered once, steadied, then dimmed by a fraction of a lumen. Enough to register subconsciously. Enough to feel like someone or something had just stepped out of the light. The interior hadn't changed, at first glance. Then Rourke saw it. The thermal reader he'd left on the floor now lay on the opposite side of the panel, neatly positioned, angled toward the conduit he'd inspected. Not dropped. Not kicked. Placed. He crouched. The device was still warm from use, but the floor beneath it was colder than the ambient temperature. He checked the panel again. The rotated clamp had been corrected. Perfect alignment. Perfect torque. No trace of adjustment. A faint shadow crossed the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. Rourke rose fast, stepping out of the shed in one smooth motion. The yard was empty. But halfway down the corridor, a small light blinked on at camera N6, diagnostic LED had only activated during manual overrides. Rourke felt his jaw tighten. Control never mentioned a maintenance team en route. He keyed the mic. Control, confirm camera override on N6. Silence. He repeated the request. The radio chirped, but no voice came through. Just an empty connection channel, held open for 3 steady seconds, then dropped. Not static, not interference. A held line. He moved toward the camera's access ladder, scanning each gap between the crates. The blinking LED slowed as he approached, its interval stretching, as if reacting to proximity. When he reached the base of the ladder, it stopped entirely. Rourke climbed, boots pressing into the rungs with controlled force. The air thickened near the top, the same dry electric scent threading through it. He reached the platform and examined the camera housing. No tools, no tampering. The override switch sat in its neutral position. Then he heard movement behind a metal, flexing against weight. He turned sharply. Below, the gate was shifting again. Not opening, breathing. A subtle in and out pulse barely visible unless you watched the vertical bars and the sliver of desert behind them. He descended the ladder fast, boots hitting gravel. The impressions near the hinge had multiplied several arcs now intersecting, each one shallow but precise, like something had tested its own range of motion against the metal. His radio clicked once. Then again, 2 taps. Rourke pivoted toward the crates, expecting a uniform, a shape, a silhouette. Nothing moved. But on the ground, just at the edge of the corridor, a boot print appeared, fresh, crisp, the pattern matching standard-issue tactical saws. Rourke stepped closer. The print ended abruptly after a single step, its direction aimed straight toward the blind spot. He followed its line to the fence. Something had left the impression of a footfall without leaving a second one. Not a jump, not a stagger. More like a reset placement without trajectory. His pulse hammered. The air felt thinner, the silence too measured. Behind him, the radios across the entire sector hissed at once. The simultaneous hiss from every radio rolled through the sector like pressure equalizing in a sealed chamber. Rourke steadied his breathing, scanning for movement. The floodlights above him dimmed not fully, just enough that their shadows stretched a fraction longer than they should, edges softening as if diffused by invisible heat. He stepped toward the blind spot. The temperature dropped again, sharper this time, enough to tighten the skin on his hands. The single boot print behind him remained untouched in the dust, but as he advanced, a second impression formed ahead slowly, grain by grain, pressed into existence by a weight he couldn't see. He watched it finalize, the heel settling last. The radios cut out. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It had an internal structure, like something pushing outward to keep sound from entering its space. Rourke reached for his flashlight, but before he switched it on, the fence to his right shifted by a hair's width. Not a shake, not a sway. A controlled adjustment, as though compensating for a momentary load. He redirected his steps toward the fence. The impressions in the gravel threaded together into a wavering path that traced along the base and angled toward a support post. At the base of that post, something rested against the metal, the same curved polycarbonate fragment he'd pocketed, but now warped, extended, no longer fingernail-sized. It was nearly the length of his palm. He hadn't dropped the original. It was still zipped into his uniform. He crouched. A faint hum vibrated through the post, regular and steady, like a machine cooling down after heavy use. The hum pulsed through the ground, up through his boots, and faded the moment he touched the metal. A voice crackled through his radio, barely a whisper, the signal thin as if transmitted from deep underground. 3 words blurred by static. North corridor clear. It wasn't Control's voice. Rourke rose, backing away from the fence. The pre-dawn light finally crept over the horizon, casting a low, angled beam across the yard. For the first time, he saw the impressions clearly, not random arcs, not drag marks, aligned, deliberate, measured with geometric regularity, each angle shifting with subtle corrections, as if something had traced the perimeter with a precision more suited to surveying equipment than movement. The shed door across the yard swung open on its own axis, slowly, smoothly, stopping mid-frame, perfectly balanced. Rourke didn't move. He watched the corridor, the fence, the shifting cold pockets in the air. Then, near the blind spot, the gravel pushed outward once more, one slow indentation, forming a final footprint. This one deeper, locked in place. Rourke fixed his gaze on it. The footprint faced the base, not leaving, not entering, waiting. A faint metallic tone echoed through the fence, traveling its length. The cadence was unmistakable, the same 2 taps used between guards on night shift, controlled, intentional, directed at him. Rourke stood alone in the widening daylight, the yard quiet, the footprint cooling in the sand, the fence holding its shape with unnatural steadiness. Somewhere along that perimeter, something had learned how to move like them, and it hadn't stopped.